This is part 2 of what is offshore wind energy and why are we resisting? I'm Elizabeth Robson and I'm with Protect the Coast Pacific Northwest, and I'm extremely concerned about the environmental impacts of offshore wind energy development. In part 1, we covered the technology for offshore wind energy projects. In part 2, we turn our attention to the many detrimental impacts of offshore wind turbines. It's probably easy to intuitively understand that offshore wind turbines will negatively impact birds. With the tips of the blades moving at up to 150 to 200 miles per hour, the most immediate impact is, of course, collision with the blades, but there are many other impacts too. The birds most likely to be impacted by offshore turbines on the Pacific coast are pelagic birds, birds who spend a large portion of their lives on the open ocean. These include the endangered marbled murrelet and the storm petrel, among many others. Migrating birds may also be heavily impacted. The Atlantic and Pacific flyways for migration are exactly where these offshore wind energy areas are being built. The map on the left shows the Atlantic flyway crossing directly where the offshore wind energy areas are being constructed. Similarly, birds migrating along the Pacific flyway will run into wind turbines if and when these offshore wind energy areas are built. 432 bird species in North America are at risk of extinction, and birds with coastal habitats are particularly vulnerable, so offshore wind energy areas and related infrastructure could have a huge impact on these at-risk birds. The way turbines impact birds include disturbance from increased boat traffic, loud noises during exploration, testing, and construction phases, more grid lines, ongoing noise and vibration from the turbines themselves, risk of collision with turbine blades, and impact to the food web that birds rely on. The impacts to whales and dolphins may be the most discussed impacts of offshore wind turbines and perhaps the most contentious. Despite many dead whales washing up on the East Coast since seismic surveys and turbine installation beginning, NOAA, Big Green Groups, and others claim that these whale deaths are not caused by offshore wind development. We know that whales and dolphins are extremely sensitive to noise. Seismic surveys and pile driving during planning and installation phases of offshore wind on the East Coast creates incredibly loud noises. Ship noise interferes with whale communication. We know this on the West Coast too, near where I live, where whale communication is interrupted by loud noise from container ships and oil tankers passing nearby. We know that underwater noise travels long distances, like whale songs do, and so it is obvious noise from additional ship traffic will interfere with hunting and with communication. We also know that loud noise can confuse and even kill whales and dolphins. Whales and dolphins frequently die from ship strikes and fishing gear entanglements. Is there a greater risk of whales becoming entangled in fishing gear or swimming in front of ships if they're confused by loud noise? Quite possibly. With the increase in ship traffic to test, install, and service offshore wind energy areas, the risk of whale and dolphin deaths will obviously rise. While NOAA claims that offshore wind has no provable impacts on whales and dolphins, at the same time they are busy issuing take permits to developers. A take permit is a permit to harass or even kill or otherwise harm wildlife, and this even includes endangered species. Why would they issue take permits if offshore wind energy is not impacting whales and dolphins and other marine mammals and wildlife? Who knows? Since 2016, NOAA has authorized over 6,340 incidental whale take permits for offshore wind developers' survey work on the East Coast, and has or is in the process of issuing take permits with permission to harm and or kill over 700,000 marine mammals in total. One of the species on the East Coast most at risk is the North Atlantic right whale. This species is critically endangered, with only about 350 individuals left in the species. They die primarily from ship strikes and fishing gear entanglement. The map on the left shows where right whales frequent off the coast of New England, and the map on the right shows the areas currently under development for offshore wind energy areas. Note that the areas frequented by North Atlantic right whales are exactly the same as the areas where wind energy areas are being developed. Some of these areas are also the most productive cod breeding and feeding grounds left on the East Coast. 2 years ago, a brave scientist in NOAA spoke up and wrote a letter to BOEM, the permitting agency for offshore wind, about the threat to North Atlantic right whales. He wrote that impacts from installed and operating turbines cannot be mitigated. Disturbance to right whale foraging could have population-level effects on an already endangered and stressed species. It is worth noting that since he wrote this letter, Sean Hayes has essentially disappeared. It's likely he's been heavily censured, if not worse, by NOAA for writing this letter. On the West Coast, we have similar whale superhighways as on the East Coast. Here's a map showing these superhighways. And a zoomed-in version shows the west coast of the United States and the whales that frequent the offshore area, including humpbacks, blue whales, fin whales, bowhead whales, and gray whales. As you can see from the map, the areas being developed for floating offshore wind energy areas are frequented by all of these whales. The migratory routes, foraging areas, and breeding grounds of whales on the west coast overlap with ship traffic, with fatal ship collisions the leading source of death for blue, fin, humpback, and gray whales. We can easily see that additional ship traffic to test, install, and service wind energy areas on the west coast will have an impact on these whales. North Pacific right whales were not included in that map, but they too migrate and forage on the west coast of the United States. Very little is known about these whales. However, they've been listed as endangered since 1970 and depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. No one knows precisely how many of these whales are left, only that it is very few. Orcas in the Salish Sea and on the west coast are doing reasonably well. However, a subgroup of orcas called the Southern Residents, a group with their own language, dialect, and unique culture, including that, unlike other orcas, they eat only Chinook salmon, are listed as endangered. Despite a recovery plan in place, the orcas continue to struggle, and their population is down to a 40-year low of 74 individuals. Again, as you can see, their habitat overlaps with ship traffic and the locations of the offshore wind energy areas. Many other marine life are impacted by offshore wind energy development, although this is a topic that has not yet been well studied, and so the full range of impacts is unknown. We know from a 2022 study that offshore wind energy areas affect the primary production of marine life and marine ecosystems, and that offshore wind projects can decrease dissolved oxygen, which negatively impacts marine ecosystems, especially in areas that already experience dead zones from agriculture and industry runoff. We know that suspended sediment from wind wake and chains moving across the seabed can impact marine life from phytoplankton on up the food web. Another 2022 study showed that non-ionizing electromagnetic fields, or EMF, affected all the species they studied, mostly land animals, but some marine animals too. And we know that marine animals like skates and sharks are extremely EMF sensitive, and that benthic invertebrates probably are too. Unfortunately, the invertebrates that live on the rocks used to bury electrical cables are likely to be especially impacted because they cannot move. This is a photo of the air wind wake created by wind energy areas. The wake here is visible because of the low fog that happened to be in the area when this photo was taken. Usually it's invisible to our eyes. This same wake is created below the surface of the water too, from all of the subsurface infrastructure. The wind wake is so profound it can change the upwelling of water along the coast. Coastal upwelling brings nutrients from colder water close to the shoreline, and these nutrients are critical to the marine food web. We know that coastal areas are the richest areas for a wide variety of marine mammals to forage and breed, so this may have a huge impact on the marine food web. A 2023 study found that wind speed changes caused by offshore wind energy areas can reduce upwelling on the inshore side of wind farms and increase upwelling on the offshore side. For a wind energy area 15 miles off the coast, this means the upwelling is bringing the nutrients 15 miles further offshore than it normally would. The same study modeled 10-megawatt turbines on the west coast and found that changes reported in wind were on spatial scales large enough to influence upwelling off the U.S. west coast. Very little research has been done on the impacts of offshore wind energy areas on upwelling and marine ecosystems, and on the U.S. west coast we don't have field data. So BOEM, the permitting agency, is permitting offshore wind energy areas with no understanding of the full impacts on coastal marine ecosystems. They're just assuming everything will be fine, or perhaps they just don't care. Bats are also heavily impacted by wind energy projects. We know from onshore wind turbines that bats are at huge risk of being killed in wind energy areas, both from direct collisions with turbines and from barotrauma. Like onshore wind turbines, offshore wind turbines are required to have lights on each turbine for air traffic. Insects are attracted to lights offshore, which attract bats. It might seem strange that bats would fly offshore to feed, but we know that bats fly up to 25 miles offshore during migration, so this isn't unusual. Wind turbines can cause bats' lungs to explode due to barotrauma. The wind turbine creates an area of extremely low pressure, and if bats fly into that low pressure, their tiny lungs explode. And of course, like birds, they can be killed directly by fast-moving turbine blades. Bat populations are difficult to track and understudied, but we know that bats are threatened by habitat loss, insect population declines, and invasive white fungus disease. As we've seen, offshore wind energy areas and the associated infrastructure are massive industrial projects. The turbines and all related components, the bases, chains, cables, anchors, specialized marine vessels, on and offshore substations, port expansions, new grid lines, factories, and more, require huge amounts of material to build. Those materials must come from somewhere. They come from mines, and the materials must then be refined. Mines and refineries and the toxic pollutants they generate have huge impacts on ecosystems. Mining for materials for wind turbines exposes radioactive material. A 2021 paper by Megan Siebert and William Rees found that rare earth metal processing for wind turbines already generates as much radioactive waste as the nuclear industry. There are many different materials used in offshore wind projects. Let's take copper as an example. Simon Michaud, who researches the materials requirement for a materials-intensive energy system to replace a fossil fuels-intensive energy system, found that to phase out fossil fuels with the first generation of technology, including wind, solar, batteries, and grid lines, would require 4.5 billion tons of copper, which would require 189 years of mining at 2019 rates of copper production. Of course, copper is just one of the many materials used in wind energy technology. Others include concrete, iron, coal, and nickel to make steel, fiberglass, aluminum, zinc, manganese, chromium, molybdenum, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, terbium, balsam wood, styrofoam, epoxies, resins, and other polymers. There are many impacts from wind energy areas beyond the impacts to the natural world and increased demand for materials. Richard York and others found that wind energy areas and other so-called renewables are not leading to a drop in fossil fuel use. Energy generated from these industrial machines is adding to the total amount of energy used globally. More energy leads to more growth, which then demands more energy to maintain. And fossil fuel use is growing faster than so-called renewable energy use, so these projects are actually increasing the demand for fossil fuels. Wind and solar energy areas supply electricity intermittently, so a backup energy supply is necessary for 24/7 guarantees of electricity. This is usually supplied by natural gas plants, which defeats the purpose of the so-called renewables, or by battery banks. As we know, batteries have their own devastating materials supply chain, and communities around the country are starting to push back hard against these battery energy storage facilities, because there is also a great risk of fire with lithium-ion batteries. If they catch on fire, the battery facilities emit huge amounts of toxic smoke and materials that contaminate water and soil. People living in communities with proposed battery energy storage sites are not happy about these projects. Offshore wind energy areas are incredibly expensive to build and get huge subsidies from the federal government. These subsidies are covered by ratepayers, so we see our costs go up. Loans are covered by taxpayers. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, which is the permitting agency for these projects, has stated about the East Coast offshore wind energy areas that there will be no measurable influence on climate change. In other words, building these offshore wind projects will not help mitigate climate change in the slightest. Green Oceans, a group fighting wind energy on the East Coast, has done research showing that rate and taxpayers subsidize East Coast wind energy 30 to 40%, and that each wind turbine costs approximately $50 million. Speaking of BOEM, this is the Department of Energy's offshore lease granting agency to the oil and gas industry and is now also in charge of developing ocean resources for energy and materials, meaning offshore wind energy and possibly offshore mining within the U.S. national waters. Their mandate does not include concern for costs to the environment, and they do not prioritize either biodiversity or the climate crisis. Their mandate is simply to manage the process to allow corporations to extract energy and materials from the ocean. As a result, BOEM overlooks, and sometimes it would perhaps seem conceals, major negative impacts on coastal marine environments. I'm with Protect the Coast Pacific Northwest, and we are focused on offshore wind energy development in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, as well as other offshore energy development. For offshore wind energy, this includes the developments in Humboldt Bay, California, Brookings and Coos Bay, Oregon, and the central Washington coast. We don't know of firm plans to develop offshore energy in BC, but we'll keep an eye out on that. Alaska has a great deal of offshore oil development already, and is looking at both wind and tidal current energy too, but has no firm plans for these that we know of. All of the wind energy areas mentioned here are floating offshore wind energy areas. In Humboldt Bay, 2 companies have obtained leases to the wind energy area, California North Floating and Canopy Offshore Wind Farm. Both are in the permitting phase. We should note that BOEM always grants permits, in part because by the time they get to the permitting phase, the leases have already been granted and companies have already sunk millions of dollars into exploration and permit development, as well as plans for supply chains, port expansion, and so on. So the pressure and incentives are strongly in favor of permits being granted. This despite the obvious potential impacts to threatened and endangered species. The area impacted by the wind turbines in Humboldt Bay will be 206.8 square miles, about 15 miles offshore, with 150 wind turbines generating about 2,000 megawatts total. Of course, the total area impacted will be far greater once you include all the onshore infrastructure, the factories, mines, refineries, and so on. The Humboldt Bay port will need to be expanded to include a new marine terminal, onshore substation, an expanded grid, worker housing, and so on. North of Humboldt is the Brookings and Coos Bay floating offshore wind energy areas. These 2 areas combined will impact 1,811 square miles off the coast of Oregon. Just 2 weeks ago, BOEM completed the initial environmental assessment, finding no significant impacts to people or the environment will be caused by the wind energy project, despite rigorous pushback from constituents and stakeholders, including tribes, fishermen, and others concerned about the impacts to the environment. The next step is that BOEM will lease these areas that will trigger the environmental impact statement process. In Washington, no formal process has begun, but 2 companies have submitted unsolicited proposals for offshore wind energy projects west of Grays Harbor for 45 miles offshore. As you can see, these areas would be uncomfortably close to the Olympic Coast Marine Sanctuary. Marine animals tend not to notice the boundaries of sanctuaries. In Washington, in addition to the floating offshore wind projects, other threats include a project here where I live for tidal energy and a wave power project. The tidal energy project is a test project my local utility, Opalco, is rigorously pursuing that would use a large machine that is about the size of a 747 and looks a bit like a plane floating on the water. A few of these machines are being used in Orkney, Scotland, but other than that, they are completely untested. Each wing of this machine has a large turbine 60 feet in diameter. The total spinning blade area would cover 2,000 square feet. The machine will likely be anchored to the seabed, similarly to how floating wind turbines are anchored. The first test machine would be deployed in the channel next to the island where I live. If that's successful, the plan would be to bring in 3 more. Each machine can power only about 400 homes. This would obviously be destructive to the marine environment, which hosts all kinds of marine animals, including the endangered southern resident orcas. The wave energy project being pursued by Pacific Coast Wave Power would deploy thousands of machines to generate electricity from the waves. Each machine would have to be anchored to the seabed and have electrical cables running between them and substations and the export cable. It is hard to imagine the scale and scope of impact thousands of these machines would have on the marine environment. Hopefully by now, you're convinced that we must resist this energy development because of the very obvious negative impacts to the marine environment. Many people already are resisting, so if you want to find a group, it's likely there's already one out there you can join. On the East Coast, there are many groups, including Green Oceans, Save Right Whales, Protect Our Coast, New Jersey, and so on. There's an effort to put wind energy areas in Lake Erie, and there's a group pushing back against that too. On the West Coast, 3 tribes are pushing back because of the threat to fisheries: the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Tlawa Dene Nation, and the Yurok tribe. In addition to the tribes, we have groups including Oregon Coast Against Offshore Wind Energy, Oregon Natural Resources Industry, React Alliance, which is based in Morro Bay, and us, Protect the Coast Pacific Northwest. I've talked a little about battery energy storage systems, or BESS, and wanted to mention these again as there are a large number of groups forming to fight these projects as well. These are connected to so-called renewable energy projects like offshore wind energy areas because these energy projects need backup for when the wind isn't blowing. If your community is impacted by a BESS project, then you may be able to find groups in opposition who can help. I also want to mention the pushback from big green groups. Large national environmental groups like the Sierra Club are pushing hard for wind energy and accuse those of us fighting wind energy of taking dark money from right-wing think tanks and from the oil industry, which is kind of funny given that many of the companies behind offshore wind energy areas are oil companies. They claim that we're climate change deniers. They claim that climate change is such a huge threat it's worth sacrificing marine ecosystems, even though BOEM itself has stated that wind energy areas will make no difference at all in mitigating climate change. Big green groups get funding from corporations with incentives to keep business as usual going as long as they can. So it's not surprising they would use these nasty tactics to slur environmentalists just trying to protect the natural world from industry. If you start or join a group fighting the status quo, it's what to expect. Protect the Coast Pacific Northwest is a loose group of individuals from up and down the West Coast and elsewhere, all people who care deeply about the ocean and marine ecosystems and wild beings. We are relentlessly biocentric, meaning we are not fighting wind turbines because of the view, or because we think fossil fuels are better, or because we think green energy is a left-wing project. We're doing this to protect the natural world. We have broadened our scope to include resisting all offshore energy development in the Pacific Northwest, which would include oil and gas development, other minerals and metals mining, tidal and current energy areas, as well as offshore wind energy areas. We are opposed to all energy and materials development in marine environments, and of course everywhere else too. If you want to help, we need people to help organize in California, Oregon, and Washington, and in BC and Alaska too, if you want to join from there. Floating offshore wind energy areas are complex and development is rapid, So we need people who can research and stay current with what's happening with the technology. In Washington, the Blue Wind Initiative is an industry group forming to address worker training and supply chains for the offshore wind industry, with lots of companies, state government, local governments, and NGOs participating. We need people who will stay on top of what's happening with that too. We need people to attend meetings and submit comments during environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. We know that submitting comments does virtually no good, but it's also good practice, and it makes sure that our views are included in the record. And this is especially important for any group that may want to later file a lawsuit. We need help with media to do things like create handouts, online information, and spread the word on social media. And we need help organizing non-violent direct action events at crucial points in the process to block machines and protest meetings. To finish off this presentation, I'd like to share a short video that our Deep Sea Defender and Protect the Coast Pacific Northwest member, Julia Barnes, made for us with her incredible art and filmmaking skills.
The Pacific Ocean is the largest wilderness on the planet, home to millions of species. Yet from Northern California to Alaska, the coast of the Pacific Northwest is threatened by industrial-scale offshore energy projects. There are plans to build hundreds of floating offshore wind turbines in the deep ocean, each over 1,000 feet tall. They require a global chain of extraction, large amounts of steel, copper, plastics, balsa wood, rare earths, and other materials linked to mining, habitat destruction, pollution, and human rights violations. Each turbine sits on a platform roughly the size of a baseball stadium. They are anchored to the seabed with massive cables and chains as thick as a human body. As ocean currents, waves, and wind move the turbine base, the chains drag across the seabed, stirring up plumes of sediment that can disrupt marine ecosystems and suffocate fish. Each turbine is connected to the grid through a cable that emits electromagnetic frequencies harmful to crustaceans, sharks, and other marine life. Hundreds and potentially thousands of turbines are being planned for the Pacific Northwest. Each would be nearly as tall as the Empire State Building, interlinked with hundreds of miles of electric cables and anchor chains. Factory-sized floating substations would gush boiling hot water into the ocean. Increased ship traffic and high levels of persistent anthropogenic noise would stress marine life, creating disturbance and displacement from traditional habitat and migration routes. Capturing energy from the wind modifies ocean currents that drive the upwelling of nutrients crucial for sustaining ocean life. Offshore wind turbines have a particularly large carbon footprint, in part due to the mining and refining required for rare earth metals, and the energy required for steel production. In a 2019 paper, York and Bell wrote that evidence from contemporary trends in energy production suggests that as renewable energy sources compose a larger share of overall energy production, they are not replacing fossil fuels, but rather expanding the overall amount of energy that is produced. More energy supply leads to more energy use, more development, more habitat loss, all of which worsens climate change and the ecological crisis. Protect the Coast Pacific Northwest is a grassroots organization dedicated to protecting the oceans by stopping all offshore energy projects. As people who love the oceans and recognize that climate change is a crisis, we oppose offshore oil drilling and so-called green energy projects like offshore wind. Both are major threats to the ocean.